Welcome, everybody. Today's lecture is on hive handling and inspections. And this lecture is really meant to give you an introduction to what you're going to be doing when you're inspecting beehives and how you should properly handle honeybees. Honeybees are a very docile organism, and when handled appropriately, can be very easy to work with. If you are mishandling them, though, they can be a bear as far as beating you up with stings and things like that, which don't make beekeeping fun. So let's look and see how we can make our inspections effective and easy on the bees. So the first thing we need to talk about is what are the leading causes of death of bee colonies. And there's lots of things that affect bees negatively and can have a very negative effect on your colony overall. So pests are one of the main drivers of colony death overall. And Varroa mite is a global epidemic as far as a pest that not only affects the fat body of honeybees, but also carries many viruses that are fatal to honeybees and detrimental to their development. So pests are a huge problem, and Varroa is the #1 issue facing beekeepers in the world today. It is the #1 driver of colony loss, so it is #1 when it comes to our losses and our leading causes of death is Varroa mite, one of the major pests of honeybees. Pathogens also are something that really cause a lot of problems for us as beekeepers. Now, there's been times in beekeeping history here in the United States where we've actually had some really bad pathogens, and American foul brood is something that came up in the United States and really almost brought the U.S. honey production industry to its knees. During the 70s and 80s, inspectors, state beekeeping inspectors here in the state of Michigan, and I think it was up until the 90s, had the right of entry to your farm to inspect your bee colonies without your permission. And if they found American foul brood in your colonies, they were able to burn your colonies to the ground without your permission. American foul brood, literally, we thought we were going to lose the entire honey industry in the United States when American foul brood really hit us hard. And so pathogens historically have been huge drivers of colony death. And that is something even still today that we deal with. American foul brood is not as prevalent as it used to be. And in fact, in my 15 years of beekeeping, I've seen it maybe 2 or 3 times actually seen American foul brood. Now, there's other things that people confuse with American foul brood, like European foul brood, but there's the key symptomology that goes along with each one of these pathogens, and they're very easy to distinguish to a professional beekeeper. But for you as an individual that may be new to this, pathogens are something that are really difficult to kind of identify. They have certain symptoms, and we're going to talk about what you should be able to tell as far as what does a healthy hive look like and what does a diseased hive look like. But this is something that you're going to have to work on over the years, is really figuring out what are the specific symptoms that go along with specific diseases. But as a beginning beekeeper, what you really need to know is what doesn't look right and what does look right. And then you employ the help of someone who's a little more experienced to help you diagnose exactly what's going on. So pathogens are huge. Non-target insecticides. This is another major driver of colony death, particularly in areas of heavy commercial agriculture where pesticides are being sprayed on large crops. So if you're in an area with, say, corn, beans, big monocultures, essentially is what we're talking about, where pesticides are being applied in a large area, that oftentimes can have an impact on your bees. One, through direct contact, so the bees are actually sprayed directly with it, or 2, you can also have residual buildup in the colony of these non-target insecticides where bees are foraging on things that have been sprayed and they're picking up small amounts of insecticides over time, and those build up in the wax. So non-target insecticides can be a big thing. And by non-target, what I mean is that non-target means that the honeybees are not the target. The target is something else, but honeybees are affected by the insecticide indirectly or directly, but they weren't the intended target. And this happens all the time. This is one of the reasons why when we do applications of pesticides, good applicators will generally do applications in the morning or in the evening. And that's because wind speeds are generally lowest during those times. And so that's when it's advised generally to spray. And generally, you're not spraying pesticides with wind speeds over 10 miles an hour. But there are situations where you will get drift off of those fields and they can interact with your bees. So non-target insecticides can be a big problem. Multi-factor stress. Bees are under a lot of stress in the environment, and particularly if bees are migratory, like commercial beekeepers, there's a lot of other factors that come into those stressors. So, stationary beehives are never on trucks, and there's been research that's shown that beehives just being on trucks and that vibration is stressful to bees. There's also all sorts of other things that come in with climate. As bees are moving across the country, they're experiencing many different climates over short periods of time. So that adaptation and the ability to adapt to those climates, it does have stress on the bees. And just the bees being in all of these different areas can cause stress. But in general, bees are subjected to many stresses that are in the landscape. And so they're interacting with plants, they're interacting with other animals in the landscape, and stress factors can come up from that as well. So there's all of these things that happen. In addition, stress can also be related to forage availability. So we have times of the year where we have dearths and there's not any forage out in the landscape, but bees are flying and they're raising bees. And so that's stressful in and of itself, that you don't have enough resources to accommodate the amount of brood that you're putting on. So another stress factor as well. Now, one of the other leading causes of death for honeybees is beekeepers. Beekeepers, particularly inexperienced beekeepers with poor hive handling skills and not a lot of education, can be very detrimental to bees. And although, I've never met a beekeeper that's come into the industry that is there to kill bees, but unfortunately, well-intentioned individuals that have no experience and have not taken the time and effort to educate themselves on the organism oftentimes are one of the leading causes of death. I see it in Facebook groups, beekeeping groups here in Michigan all the time, about people who have just gotten bees, can't even tell the difference between a queen, a drone, and a worker, have no idea what the difference between brood and capped honey are. These are simple things that you have to know before you ever keep bees. And by getting into the industry feet first with no experience, oftentimes you are one of the major drivers of death for honeybees. And hobbyists have the highest losses of death of bees compared to professional beekeepers. Absolutely. Much higher rates of loss because of inexperience and lack of education. The one thing I always tell beekeepers as they're getting started in the industry is if you're working with me in an education program, I always say, this is not the year to keep bees. If you have never kept bees and you are just starting an education program, take the education program first in your first year. Find a mentor or someone that you can shadow to work with to get a little bit of experience, and then start with bees. Because the experience that you get over that first year, one, is going to help you determine if this is really a hobby that's for you. And two, it's going to allow you to get some experience so that when you do get those bees, not only do you have a little bit of education under your belt, you know what you're looking at least, but then you also may have a mentor that you can reach out to help you. Because over time, there's going to be a lot of things that you're going to see that are just going to be tough to determine. And you have to be able to determine these things as a beekeeper to make sure that your bees are staying healthy. Now, when it comes to hive handling, this again is one of those things that really takes experience, but has a huge impact on your overall fun of keeping bees and the fun of your bees. So when you're handling a beehive, and if you're being careless, if you're moving too fast, if you're dropping frames, if you're smashing bees, if you're crushing bees in between frames, all of these things bees are perceiving. I think the thing that we think of oftentimes, and I kind of think this is the mindset of like dominion over the natural world, which is something that I can't stand. But we do not have dominion over these honeybees. We are participating in an activity with them, and we are supporting one another. And so whatever your activity is, whatever you're doing on that beehive, they are participating in that. And so you need to be conscious of the fact that whatever your action is, there is going to be a reaction from the honeybees. You are not just going in there and just making your will on honeybees. You are participating with this organism in their life cycles, in their management, all of that. And so whatever you do to these colonies will impart stress. If you're crushing bees, if you're keying them up, if you're moving too fast and they're coming after you, that is stressful. And over time, especially when you're doing inspections, if you're being rough with your bees and you have a colony open for say 40 minutes or something like that, it's going to cause a lot of fatigue on the bees. It's going to cause a lot of fatigue on you, and it's going to stress out both of you because it's going to be just a constant battle. There's no working together. It's you trying to force your will upon an organism that is not going to cooperate very easily with you and has the ability to sting you if they don't want to do what you're doing, or they don't like what you're doing. So stress and fatigue comes on with your poor hive handling. Crushing bees is one thing. You're going to key off alarm pheromone when you're crushing bees, and so that's going to cue up the entire colony. When you start crushing those bees, the other bees notice. It's not like they're, again, inactive participants. Dead queens is another thing that happens. You poorly handling hives, say pulling frames out from the middle of the hive without giving yourself any room to move any frames. What you do is you roll bees, and you essentially have a very high probability in the brood chamber of killing your queen by doing those types of things, pulling frames out of right of the middle of the hive without giving yourself any space. And I'll talk about how we enter the hive here in just a bit. Stings, the more poor your hive handling is, the more stings you will get. And I see it all the time on the internet. People wear their stings like badges of honor. And in reality, we all are going to get stung as beekeepers. But if you're getting stung 10 or 15 or 20 times in a single session of working bees, that is a key indicator that you have poor hive handling skills and that you do not know what you're doing when it comes to handling bees, because nobody should be getting stung that much working bees. We'll all get stung a few times. It happens. But if you are getting stung excessively, that is a key indicator that you are handling your hives much too roughly. And that is just plain and simple. It's as clear as I can give it to you. Your poor hive handling skills also is just going to reduce the fun of this. Nobody likes getting stung, and getting stung 10 times can really take the fun out of things. And so don't, really practice on hive handling as one of the key skill sets that you need to develop as a beekeeper, because it's just going to make all of this much, much easier for you and your bees. So when it comes to hive handling, this colony right here, these boxes of bees right here deserve your respect. And when you're approaching these colonies, you need to approach these colonies in a very calm and easy manner. And so that means just walking up to them, right? And so one of the key things that you should kind of take to heart, and I love this phrase, is don't be a bear. Bears are one of the major predators of honeybees, and they will make short work of a bee yard very quickly. But they're also a co-evolved predator with honeybees. And so honeybees have evolved with this predator over time, and actually there are several key indicators from bears that bees will key onto. So number one, don't be a bear. Don't make a lot of noise. Bears are not very quiet individuals when they come into a bee yard. They're smashing boxes, they're tearing things apart. Don't be loud and create a lot of disturbance when you walk into a bee yard. In particular, some people like to use like pavers or things like that on top of their outer covers so that they don't come off with wind, or big rocks. A prime example that I see lots of people do when it comes to sound is take that brick off and then just drop it onto the ground next to the colony. The second that thud hits that thing hits the ground and makes a thud, the bees immediately key into that. So they are very conscious of loud sounds going on around them. I knew a beekeeper way back in the day, an inexperienced beekeeper, who used to knock on the front of their beehives before they opened it. And he used to tell me it was to let the bees know that he was going to be working them. The bees know you are going to be working them the second you open that lid. They don't need any disturbance before you open it. You're just going to key them up, and they're going to be prepared to attack as soon as you open that lid when you're making loud sounds in the apiary. The smell of carbon dioxide is also a key indicator that bees use to locate predators. So this goes back to don't be a bear. Now, there's nothing we can do about breathing, right? You breathe in oxygen, you breathe out carbon dioxide. There's nothing we can do about that. But I want you to understand that this is a key factor. And so when bees generally attack, one of the first places they go for is the face. And the reason is because a bear is, you see this big face right here? There's very few places on this bear where you could sting them and it's actually going to do anything. If you sting them in the butt, if you sting them in the side, if you sting them in the back, there's all these fat stores, tons of fur. There's no way you're going to have any effect on them as a bee. But the face is very vulnerable. And so as these predators co-evolved, carbon dioxide is actually a signal that bees use to key in on so that they can follow it back to a predator. They follow the plume of CO2 back to the predator and its source, and that is where they will sting generally first. So when you're beekeeping bees, what this looks like when you can tell that your bees are getting a little testy because you're being too much of a bear when it comes to breathing, or it comes down to hive handling. Carbon dioxide is not just, they're not just going to pick up on carbon dioxide and go after it. This is in the context of poor hive handling. So if you're handling poorly, the first place the bees are going to key into is your face. And so the way you can tell that things are getting a little stressful for the bees is you'll start to have individuals bop you in the veil. That's a very, very good indication that they are looking to attack you because they're coming for that CO2 signal that's at your face. Don't look like a bear in the apiary. Bees are also keyed into dark colors. And so when we're keeping bees, generally you want to wear light colors. Don't wear a black suit. Don't wear black gloves. Don't wear anything black. Don't wear dark colors when you're keeping bees. It's as simple as I can say, because that's what bears look like, is big dark figures. And then when it comes back down to it, don't handle your hives like a bear. Don't be clumsy. Don't be harsh. Don't move fast. Don't be destructive. Be gentle and easy. Don't be a bear, okay? And the reason is because bears make terrible beekeepers. This is one of our apiaries that got attacked by a bear. Thankfully, there was only one hive in it. We were getting ready to shut it down for the season. It's a seasonal apiary that we use for nuke production, but we had a hive back there, and you can see in this picture, there's just frames everywhere, boxes tipped over. Bears make terrible beekeepers, so don't be a bear, okay? And those are some simple things to think about. Sound, the way you approach a colony is very important. Be quiet, move slowly, be gentle, be calm, and the bees will reward you in return. All right, so now let's start talking about the inspection itself. Hive handling is really important, being gentle, moving slow. And we're going to incorporate this into the context of an inspection here for the rest of this lecture. So the first thing we need to talk about is what your plan is. When should you be inspecting your bees? And typically during the season, as we're getting rolling, you're going to be inspecting your colony every 3 to 4 weeks. Now, there are times of the year where you may need to jump in a little earlier than that. Spring buildup is a prime example. You might need to go in every 2 weeks for spring buildup just to make sure you have enough space and that your colonies aren't getting to a point where they're building too quickly and may swarm. So that's a little bit of a different scenario. But typical regular inspections where we're doing mite checks, we're doing queen checks, we're doing resource checks, all of that every 3 to 4 weeks during the season. Okay. And the reason we do every 3 to 4 weeks is the worker life cycle is 21 days. And so if we're in there every 3 weeks, we're seeing that constant flip over of that life cycle. You also want to take days that are warm temperatures. Typically temperatures that are, if it's sunny in the 50s, you'll be all right. But typically 60 degrees is a nice temperature to use as a benchmark for doing regular inspections. And regular inspections for us in the Upper Peninsula and the Northern Michigan typically start, full comprehensive inspections typically start in June. Usually May is our buildup month, and there's a lot happening in the colony during that time. A little too much happening to be worrying about mite inspections and things like that. You want to let them kind of get sorted out after winter survival and spring buildup before you start doing mite management and inspections. And typically the reason that this is key also is that when we look at population dynamics of Varroa mite, we know from research that Varroa levels in the spring tend to be pretty darn low. It's typically we see Varroa start to really ramp up at the end of June through July and peak kind of at the beginning of August. So usually in the early part of the season, Varroa is not a big issue with well-managed bees because they've overwintered and your mites are not reproducing during the winter. So this is why you can start these usually in about mid-June is when I start them. But you want warm temperatures, and typically by that time, we're in those temperatures, those 60-degree temperatures or so. And the reason you want it to be nice and warm is because the colder it is, the bees are clustered up on brood. There's going to be more of your foragers there on cold days because they're not out foraging. Those are the oldest bees and tend to be the angriest bees. So usually when the foragers are around, that's also when you're going to get tagged up more in the colony. And that's why it's important to work your colony in the middle of the day. During the middle of the day is when most of your foragers are out collecting resources. And so what's left in the colony is essentially your house bees, your nurse bees, and those are the gentlest bees in the colony. And so that's why working during the middle of the day is pretty nice. I generally, when we start working bees, and even today as a prime example, as soon as I'm done recording this, I'm going back out to the apiary. I'm going to be in the apiary around 10:30 or 11 o'clock. And that's usually when I like to start working. If you're on a commercial crew or have thousands of hives, that's a totally different scenario. We run right now, we have about 120 hives on the property. And so, I can give myself a little bit of that, and I don't get through them all in one day, but you want to make sure that you use in the middle of the day. If you work bees later in the day, all those foragers are going to be back and they're going to be tagging you up. If you work early in the day, it's the same thing. The foragers are there and they're gonna sting you, especially if you're handling the hives roughly. The goal for inspections, and this is going to seem, I know for new beekeepers, this seems way unrealistic, but this is what I want you to work towards, is you should be spending no more than 10 to 20 minutes in each beehive for a comprehensive inspection. Now, I know that sounds like a short period of time, but the thing you need to understand is that the bees themselves, the longer you have that open, the more testy they're going to get. And there is specific information that we are looking for. You don't need to pull every single frame in a colony to do an inspection. Okay? We're looking for key things, and 99% of the things that we're looking for are in the brood chamber. The honey supers are just for storing honey. You could pick up a box and tell if it's full or not. You could pull 2 or 3 frames out of a honey super and see if you have enough room for storage still, and if you need to add another super because you're filling out with honey. A honey super, looking in those honey supers, should take 1 or 2 minutes. You do not need to pull a bunch of frames. Essentially what you're going to do, and this is how I like to do it, and we'll get into this here, but essentially what you're going to do is you're going to be really focused on the brood chamber. You may just pull a few honey super frames just to see where you're at on resources as far as how much honey they're bringing in and how full your super's getting. But the massive amount of information you're looking for are in those bottom boxes. So what are we looking for when we open a beehive? We're looking for the number of frames of bees, giving us an idea of the size of our colony that we can use to track. Going to a colony and being able to say, okay, I have 20 frames of bees when I open this up is good. Because if you come back to the next inspection and you have 10 or 5, something has gone wrong. You've had a swarm, or there's a steep decline in population, maybe because of some disease or mite presence. So this gives you an idea of what's going on in the colony, and it's the only way we can estimate population. You're not going to count the number of the bees in your colony. This is the only way you can estimate population. So that's one thing we're looking for when we do inspections. The other thing we're looking for is queen status, and we're going to either see the queen when we do the inspection, we're going to see eggs when we do the inspection, which tells us that she was there in the last 3 days, because you're not always going to find the queen, especially when the colonies are big in the middle of the season. Or you're going to be able to tell that you're queenless. One of those 3 things. The next thing that we're going to be doing during inspection is mite count. And you're going to do this on every single inspection. Is you're going to count the number of mites you have per 300 bees, which is about a half a cup of bees. Now, we'll be going over this in detail as far as how exactly to do this, but this is a key, most important thing for you to understand, is that this is absolutely critical. Not doing mite monitoring is essentially taking a hands-off approach to mite management, and I guarantee you your bees will not make it. Monitoring for mites. There's been a lot of research that's been done with this, and it is a very effective tool, and the only tool we have to estimate populations of mites per a standardized amount of bees. Using screen bottom boards and counting mite drop uses no standardization, so you have no idea how many mites per X number of bees. You have to standardize the number of bees that you're using in order to get an accurate estimate. So the alcohol wash and the powdered sugar roll, both of which I will show you how to do, are the only methods that you will use for mite monitoring. All right, and the last thing that we're going to look at is disease. And disease, again, I said this earlier, I don't expect you to be able to diagnose a disease. What I expect and what I'm going to show you how to do in this lecture is determine what's healthy and what's not. And when you see something that's not healthy, I would encourage you to employ the skills of an expert until you are firmly skilled in the ability to diagnose these diseases. And there's not very many of them. It's not like they're hard to diagnose. It's just you have to memorize the symptoms and be able to identify them when you see them. That's really what it comes down to. So this is not a Herculean task to teach yourself how to diagnose bee diseases. It's just something that most people, it's usually very outside of people's skill sets. To be able to look at an insect and diagnose it. So that's why it seems, think it seems like a very big task for a lot of beginners. And you already got a lot on your plate. Beekeeping is a very education heavy hobby. It takes a lot of education to be successful at beekeeping, and so diseases is part of that education. Final thing you're going to have in here in your notes when you're doing inspections is, what are your needs, or whatever the needs of the bees. Do they need space? Do you need to bring out a super? Are they short on food? Things like that. This is the Hive data sheet that I gave you all copies of, so that you have access to this template to use in your own beekeeping operation. So this is what you're going to be using to catalog everything that you see in an inspection when you do it. And before you get into the apiary to do your inspections, you need to make sure that you have all of the proper equipment for working your bees. My mentor in California, Scott Jeffries, when I was taking classes from him at Cal Poly, his mantra before we went into the apiary was hive tool, smoker, and veil. Those are the three basic tools that you need every time you enter the apiary. Hive tools used for working the bees. Smokers are used for drawing down the temperament of a situation, kind of, again, calming bees from our perspective, not calming bees from their perspective, but calming bees from our perspective using smoke. And then obviously the veil to keep your face safe and your body free from stings. The other thing that you may want to think about is gloves. So this is a topic of discussion that we've discussed before in the equipment lecture. And what I really want to impress upon you is, again, there's levels of glove protection, right? So typical beginning beekeeper gloves are the ones you see on the left, which are the heavy leather gloves. Heavy leather gloves, although they work for making you feel like you're safe, and they do a good job of protecting you as far as stings are concerned, they are very clumsy. And I've yet to see somebody who had a pair of gloves that really fit nice and tight, because they're always big and just kind of clumsy, fumbly gloves. You will crush bees with these gloves because you have no dexterity. You have no ability to feel a bee under your finger when you're grabbing a frame with these heavy gloves. And so you will crush bees with these gloves. Now, I understand as a beginner, you need to feel safe, because if you don't feel safe, you're going to make way more mistakes than just a pair of gloves is going to cause in a colony. So if you need these gloves, make sure you have them. But you need to really, as you become more familiar with honeybees, as you work them longer, you need to get away from those gloves. And one of the nice alternatives is nitrile gloves. Bees will sting through them if you crush a bee with your hand, but in general, they don't recognize the surface to sting. So if they land on your hand, say that you're putting your hand in the colony and bees come at your hand immediately, maybe because you move too fast, when those bees hit the glove, they're not going to sting immediately like they would with the hand, because they recognize skin as a surface to sting. But that nitrile glove is something they don't recognize. The nice thing also about nitrile gloves is that you have dexterity at that point. You can feel everything. And so as you grab a frame, you can feel those bees moving under your hand, and you can let them pass before you actually pick up the frame. Now, you can also go gloveless, and that's what you see on the right here with me holding this frame. Gloveless is great. I go gloveless quite often in my own apiaries. However, I do wear nitrile gloves a lot One, because sometimes I just don't want all the stickiness. You know, if I'm going to be working 60 or 70 hives in a day, I by the end of the day, my hands are just covered in propolis and wax and honey and everything else. And it's just nice to be able to take off a pair of gloves and not have all that stuff on your hands. But, you know, if I'm doing something simple, maybe marking queens is a great example. I don't use any gloves for that. Or if I'm just working in, you know, a few hives that day, I may not wear gloves. But not wearing gloves is something that takes a long time to get comfortable with. You will get stung, but it's maximum dexterity. If you're moving slow and it's during the good time of the season, which is during the honey flow, bees are really docile, and so you generally don't get stung much. Gloveless in the fall is a different scenario. Bees get very, very defensive in the fall, and will sting you pretty much because you're walking by a beehive, because they're protecting all of those resources. So seasonality can also have an effect on glove wearing. But when you're doing inspections, you want to make sure that you, one, feel protected, but two, as you continue your experience, are moving out of those big, heavy gloves so that you have better dexterity, which will give you better hive handling skills. And gentle inspections really are the key. This is something that when I started up, you know, beekeeping, and I think for everybody, it's not something that we readily understand. But those bees are watching every move you make. And if you move fast, they will react. And so being slow, moving, and I don't mean, you know, moving at a glacial pace. I mean moving in smooth movements and not, you know, putting your hand into a hive or grabbing something really quickly. Those are the movements, those quick movements are the things that bees will attack immediately. But if you take your hand and you could run it over the top of a frame, an inch above the frame full of bees, and move it over slowly, and they will not even react to it. They will see it, they will notice it, you will see them watching it, but they won't react to slow movements. And so moving slow is key. In addition, being present has a huge impact on beekeeping. It's one of the things that I love the most about beekeeping is this idea of forced mindfulness. So, you know, we live in a very busy world and our minds are always thinking about all these other things going on in our lives. Well, beekeeping, when you're in a hive, you need to be present. You don't need to be thinking about anything else. You need to be in that hive with those bees. And if you start thinking about other things in your life and you get distracted, you're going to get sloppy. And the bees are going to let you know, and they're going to let you know by stinging you. So beekeeping is not just a practice in being gentle and moving slow. It's also a practice in mindfulness. And it's, you know, I work with a lot of veterans. I'm a, you know, disabled veteran myself. And, you know, I work with a lot of veterans that have all sorts of things related to their military service. This aspect of mindfulness is one of the most impactful things I've seen in the thousands of veterans that I've worked with. This idea of having to be present is one of the most therapeutic things that you can do. And you don't have to have suffered from PTSD from combat. You could be just dealing with personal trauma. And this is an opportunity for you to practice being present with your bees. So that's one of the biggest parts about being gentle, is just being mindful of what you're doing, who you're working with, and being present with them. This relationship we have with bees is a beautiful thing. So embrace it, and really embrace them as an organism that you're caring for and that is caring for you also. All right, so now we're going to actually take ourselves into the apiary, and I'm going to walk you through an inspection. Now, we're going to have an instructional video that goes along with inspections, but this is the approach you need to be taking. So the right approach. The right approach is you walk up to your beehives quietly. You're not throwing stuff down. You're not dropping things on the ground. You walk up to them quietly, and you start the process of working into the beehive. Now, the wrong approach, and one of the things that I see a lot of folks do, including colleagues of mine, it's just my personal, you know, opinion when it comes to smokers. I am a very, very big advocate of minimal smoke. Many times, and folks that come and do workshops with here on the farm with us, most of the time I will have a smoker going, but we never end up using it. Because most of the time the bees are docile if you're working them gently. But a lot of folks will preemptively smoke. And this is a picture of myself kind of showing this as a demo of people will come up to an entrance of a beehive that they're getting ready to work, and they'll just smoke the hell out of it. You've already, at that point, before you even open the hive, you've already induce stress into your colony. And if you've ever smoked bees, you know the sound that changes immediately when they get hit with smoke. It goes to a high frequency buzz. They dive down into the colony. They start moving quickly. Things change immediately when smoke is introduced to a colony. So approaching a colony, you should never, unless it is a very hot hive, and by hot, I mean you get near it and it just starts stinging you. You should never be smoking a colony before you open it. You always just walk up to the colony calmly, quietly, and open it up. And when you open it up, what you're going to see is this. If you open it up and bees are right there at the top, or even when you get down into the brood chamber, so you've got a couple empty boxes on top and you get down in the brood chamber, this is what you're going to see. Before you do anything, look at what you're looking at. This is not just a box of insects that are not paying attention to what's going on. All of these eyes that you see in between these frames are watching you. They're watching every movement you make, and they're ready to react to any movement that is quick, any crushing of bees. They're ready to go. They know you're there. They know you're working them. The idea is that we're working with one another in collaboration. We're not putting our will on bees. We're not putting dominion over anything. We're participating and collaborating. And so your bees are paying attention to you. Now, if I took my hand over this frame right here real slowly and just moved it across, they're just going to watch me. But the second I get fast, you're going to have a half a dozen bees on your hand immediately. So speed is huge. So when you open the hive, that is key. The other thing that is key, when you open the hive, and this goes for every box as you're going down the colony, the very first thing you're going to do for data collection on your inspection as you're going down that colony is you're going to count the number of frames of bees for each box as you go down. So you start at the top. Again, you don't have to pull out frames in a honey super if you don't want to. You can lift the box and tell if it's full. If it's full, it's going to have weight to it. If it's not going to have much weight to it. But you still need to count the number of bees on those frames. And so what I mean by counting the number of bees on frames is this. And let's look at this picture. You see this is an 8-frame hive. I'm going to count the number of frames of bees with you starting from the left. And what we're looking for, and this is just a ballpark. We're looking for the number of frames of bees that have bees on the front and the back of the frame. So both sides of the frame. If you have it on one side of the frame, we're not going to count it. Both sides of the frame. So let's look at these frames. One to the far left, there's bees on both sides of the frame, clearly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 frames of bees in this column, in this box. And that's how you count. Simple, right? It's just an estimate. It does not have to be exact. Again, it's a tool that we're using to be able to determine population dynamics over the course of the season and whether we're seeing reductions or increases in population over that time. Ideally, you want to see increases for most of the season. But as we get to the end of the season, you're going to see decreases because colonies are shutting down for the winter. So it gives you a good estimate. It also is a great estimate for disease and pest presence and causing declines of colonies. So that's the first thing you're going to do is count the number of frames. Now, once you get down to the brood chamber, that's where the business is, right? That's where we're actually going to start really collecting data. Because up top is just honey storage. Remember that. It's just honey storage. When the boxes get about 70% full of honey, it's time to add a new one. That's basically that. But there's nothing in those boxes and those honey supers other than honey that's going to give you indications of what's important. Honey is only one aspect of bees, right? There's much more going on in this colony than just honey storage, and that's what we're really looking for. So when we get to the brood chamber, how do we remove our frames? Well, let's recall what's in the brood chamber. The middle of the brood chamber is your brood, your eggs, your larvae, and your pupa, and that is typically where you're going to find your queen, is in that area as well. Immediately around the brood, you're going to see pollen and honey. That's the food resource for the bees to feed the young bees. And then on the outside, you're going to see honey. So when we look at how this is configured as a brood chamber, you need to be taking frames out from the outside first, and then you work your way in. And the reason for that is those honey frames on the outside, there's not going to be valuable bees on there, let's say, for example. There's going to be house bees on there that are transferring honey from foragers as they come in and bringing them up into the brood nest. But the bees that are on these frames, for the most part, in general, are not going to be, say, your queen. So we always start by working from the outside in. We never start in the middle of the brood chamber because you have a very high probability of hurting or killing your queen by trying to squeeze those frames out. You're going to be rolling bees on both sides of the frame, and they're just going to be getting crushed, and you're going to piss off everybody. So we start from the outside. So like this picture here of one of my students, you can see he's doing a very good job by starting at this outside frame. He's going to pull that frame out, and he's going to set it aside. And what you can see, as we move forward in this, is this frame, and this is the same frame that's pulled out. This is his partner, but you can see that the frame that she's holding is a honey frame, and that's what you would expect to find on the outside. You're going to pull that frame out first, and you're going to set it aside. And what that does is that gives you a whole frame's worth of room to be able to, when you're working the frames, to pull the frame back from the next frame. Give yourself some space and then pull it out. And then you don't have the two frames rubbing next to each other or against each other as you're pulling frames out. This is how you don't crush bees, is you give them a little space when you're pulling things out. Now you'll also notice how she's handling the frames. And she has the frames with her pointer finger right underneath the side of the frame here, underneath that ear right there, and then her thumbs are firmly planted on the top. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to flip the frame over back and forth very easily. Now, that's something that, again, is part of beekeeping, is you're inspecting both part of those sides of those frames, so you need to have your hands positioned in a way that makes it easy to do that. Now, I'll be real honest, a frame like this that she's holding, this is a honey frame in deep equipment, that probably weighs 7 or 8 pounds. That sometimes is hard on people's hands that have arthritis. This is one of the reasons why mediums are a good option for folks that are dealing with any kind of disabilities or limitations physically when it comes to working hives, is you can reduce weight that way. But you're always going to pull that outside frame out first, and then this is going to be how you properly handle those frames. Now, when you're handling them and you're pulling the frames out, now you can pull out a couple of them to give yourself more room, but you're going to have to set them somewhere. And there is a proper way to set frames down, and there's an improper way to set frames down. And both of these pictures show proper ways to set frames down. You can see in this picture, I'm showing the use of a frame holder. So this is a device that attaches to the side of your hive body and allows you to put frames there as you're taking them out. The nice thing about that is that you can keep these in order, right? And frames always have to go back in exactly how they came out. You're never going to be, misplacing frames. You always are going to be taking them out in the order that you took them out, or putting them back in the order you took them out in. So having a frame holder like this can sometimes be nice if you want to be able to keep organized. But you can see, again, I'm moving from the outside, and then you can see that I've pushed that next frame all the way to the end so that I have lots of room to work the frame after that. So this is a way that you can shift things in the colony, shift the frames in the colony so that you're giving yourself maximum amount of space to get those frames out. You don't have to pull all frames out. Usually 2 is plenty of frames to give yourself lots of room to work with. Now, frame holders are one thing, but some of us don't have frame holders or don't want to buy frame holders. The second way that you're going to put frames down, store them, is by setting them on their edge, on the ground. So the big thing about frames and hive bodies, anything beekeeping related, is everything has propolis on it. The second it makes contact with the ground, it's going to pick up leaves, grass, everything else it gets stuck to. When you put a hive body down like this, or I'm sorry, a frame down like this on its edges, you only have two small points of contact at the bottom, and that's the ear and then the edge of the frame. And so typically that doesn't create a lot of debris. So if you don't have a frame holder, setting your frames on edge works perfectly, just like this. You never want to set a frame down long ways on the ground, because that long side is all in contact with the ground and will pick up all sorts of things. And of course, you would never lay them flat on the face. That is obviously not something you would do. But these are the two ways that you're going to store your frames as you're working through your beehives. All right, so now that we've got our frames out and we've reached the brood, we've gone through our honey frame and our pollen frame, and now we're seeing brood essentially in the brood chamber. Now we're going to start inspecting those aspects of the brood chamber that are so critically important to determine the health and productivity of our colony. So we've pulled our brood frame out. Let's look and see what are the things that you're going to be looking for in the brood chamber. So number one, as you're pulling brood frames out, you need to determine if you're queen right. This happens one of two ways. One, you see the queen. She's there. You have eyes on her. The other way is through eggs. And eggs, if you remember your life cycles, eggs last for 3 days before they hatch. So if you see eggs, you can pretty safely say that you're queen right, because she was there in the last 3 days, which is very close to where our inspection's at, right? So those are the two ways you're going to determine your queen right. Now, you may be queenless, and you may see no eggs and no queen, or you may see a laying worker situation where you have multiple eggs in each cell. But what you need to determine is if you are queen right. If you see a queen or if you see eggs, you're good to go. If you don't see those two, one of those two things or both of them, something is going on. Now, you as a new beekeeper may not be able to tell what exactly is going on, but that's where you can employ someone with a little bit more skill. But essentially, the queen is going to be easy to find when the colonies are small. When the colonies get big over the course of the season, she becomes very difficult to find. I mean, you're talking like one bee in 60,000, right? So being able to see eggs is critical to be able to tell your queen right throughout the season, because you will not find your queen every time. And again, that 10 to 20 minute target that we're trying to hit with inspections, you are not going to spend an hour trying to find a queen just to determine if you're queen right. You can see eggs very readily in frames and be able to determine that very quickly without having to waste a bunch of time and keep that hive open and stressed out. So as you start to gain your skill sets, you have to be able to see eggs. You have to. I know folks will tell me that have been beekeepers for years that, oh, well, I can't see eggs. This is not an option, okay? This is that you have to work to be able to do this. Whether it's employing black foundation so that you can see those eggs easier in your brood chamber, whether it's employing a magnifying glass, a flashlight, or a combination of the three, whatever it takes, you have to be able to see this. Because just seeing cat brood tells you nothing. Cat brood can exist in a laying worker situation all day long. And if you're just looking at cat brood and saying I'm queen right, you may go back to your hive in 4 weeks and it's full of drones and laying workers, and now you've completely lost the colony. Eggs are critical to be able to see. So, queen right. Determine your queen right. That's one of our main points in our inspection. The next thing, disease while we're inspecting these brood frames. The only place you're going to see evidence of disease is brood frames. Spending your time looking at honey frames is a waste of time because the information's in the brood chamber. So how do you tell whether I have a diseased hive or not? Now, again, I don't expect you to be able to diagnose diseases at this point in your beekeeping career, something you should aspire to, but you need to determine what's unhealthy and healthy. Okay, so we have two brood frames here. One of them is this beautifully capped brood frame, kind of our textbook brood frame, and then the other one is this one over here that has brood, but you can see that there's a lot of spottiness in the frame, and this could be the signs of an unhealthy colony, but it may not. And this is where it really starts to get important for you to understand the details, because I know, and this is a symptom of all sorts of things related to disease and pest pressure, is spotty brood. It's one of the things that you'll hear a lot of people say, oh yeah, if you have spotty brood, something's going on. But spotty brood, when we say spotty brood, we mean that these cells that you see in this picture, that all of these cap cells, yeah, they're there, but the cells in between those open cells, what we mean by spotty brood is that those cells have nothing in them. And oftentimes you can come to a colony and see what looks like spotty brood, and essentially it's just a brood frame that's hatching out concurrently while she's laying eggs. And so there may be young brood in those open cells and cap brood next to them. And although at arm's length it looks like spotty brood, you can't make any determinations on disease at arm's length. You've got to get into the brood and you've got to get close. So just looking at these two frames right here, you have no idea whether either one of these is a healthy colony or not. You got to get closer. And so let's look at what we would be looking for as an indicator, as a symptom of a disease present in our hive when we get close to the brood. So let's look at a close-up. On the left, you see brood that's uncapped. So this is, we're going to do uncapped and then capped. What does healthy brood look like that's uncapped? And what does healthy brood look like that's capped? And conversely, what does unhealthy look like? So on the left is our healthy, on the right is our unhealthy. Now, you can see in both of these, there's capped brood, and the capped brood looks fine. So that's not an indication of disease at all. When we look closely in the one on the left, the healthy frame, what I want you to see, and what you should always see when inspecting a colony, is bright white larvae. So every single one of these larvae in here are white in color. And when we look at the young ones, you can see there's a pool of royal jelly down there that's white also. When larvae are this color and when food is this color, it is healthy. If there is any discoloration, yellow, brown color, that is an indication that those larvae have been fed contaminated food. And typically what that food is contaminated with is bacterial spores. And oftentimes one of the major pathogens that we see that is fed to bees through the food is European foul brood. And European foul brood, your brood will change color when it's affected by European foul brood. And it will look kind of like a yellowish color. That's an indicator that that's not healthy brood. But if you see this is healthy. It's bright white, and you've got these bright white larvae. The other thing that you need to notice with these larvae are that they are all seated at the bottom of the cell. So that C that you see that they make it this C shape. It's seated at the bottom of the cell. The larva will always be positioned in that shape at the bottom of the cell. Now, it grows over time, and you can see in some of these lower cells here that it's filled the cell out, but it's still seated at the bottom in that C shape. Once the larva starts to prepupate and turn, that's when it gets capped. So when you're looking at larva, it's always going to be seated at the bottom of the cell, because as soon as it starts to turn, it gets capped. You don't see the larva straighten out in the cell. That's something that happens under a cap. And so what you're always looking for is bright white larva that's seated at the bottom of the cell. Now let's take a look at our unhealthy frame. So you see that there's larvae in here seated at the bottom of the cells. So we're looking into these spots. But then what I want you to notice is this cell here, these cells in the middle right here, this cell right up top here. You see another one over here, one right here. Now, although this brood looks healthy, the cap brood, this larva, all of these larvae are twisted and they're at the bottom of the cell, right? They're or like basically nailed down to the side of a cell. That is, you will never see that in a healthy colony. That is an indication of disease. And this happens to be European foul brood that we're looking at right here. This is very important for you to understand, because you don't need to know what it is. You just need to know that it's something, right? And that now you need to take the next step. Maybe that's going and hitting the books and starting to look at symptomology of all of these different diseases that affect honeybees. Or maybe it's calling somebody and saying, hey, I have larvae that doesn't look right. Can you come and help me and see what's going on? But eventually you'll get to a point where you're able to diagnose these and see that this isn't right. But this is the key indicator. If you don't see those bright white cells with C shape at the bottom of the cell, if they're on the side, if they look discolored, you can see one in this picture that's even got a dead head on it. This is essentially necrosis that's hitting this larva right here. But this is all indication that something's wrong, whether you can determine what it is or not. That is an unhealthy colony right there. Something is affecting it disease-wise. Now let's look at capped brood, because that's uncapped brood. Its coloration is huge. When it comes to capped brood can give you an indication of disease. And one of the major diseases that is identifiable by anomalies in capped brood is American foul brood. So the difference between American foul brood, and we'll cover this in detail in pests and pathogens, but the difference between American foul brood and European foul brood from the symptom standpoint is that European foul brood kills the larva before the cell is capped. And so when we look at our previous picture, those larvae that are slumped over are dead, but they were never capped. They died before the cap went on. That is when European foul brood affects the larva. For American foul brood, it affects the larva after it's capped. And so the larva is capped, and then that cell dies. Then that bee in that cell dies. And so when we're looking at caps, what we're looking for is what we see on the left here, which are these even caps that are all kind of like nice and nice color and just look very, very symmetrical, right? They're kind of capped right with the top of the cell. There's no sinking to any of the cells or no discoloration. When we look at the right picture, these are sunken cells that you see here. You see these cells in here. Oops, let me get my cursor over here. You see these cells in here. They're sunken and they've got greasy tops to them. Those don't look right. In addition, if you look at some of these cells right here, you see that these look like they were uncapped, but if you look closely, you can see these were all capped cells. And what they're doing is they're uncapping this larva now and pulling out the diseased larva. You can see even on these open cells that those fringes around the cell are ragged. That's from the bees chewing the cell open to get that larva out. And they'll do this as a cleaning behavior to get all of these bees or all of these dead bees out. What happens though is as they're cleaning these out, is that they're also interacting with the bacterium that's causing this pathogen. And so that becomes a big problem. So these are things that you want to be able to see is what is a healthy larva, just knowing what that looks like, and what does healthy capped brood look like. If you don't see those, you see one of these other conditions, something's going on. So that's a very easy way to tell if you have disease or not, right? You don't even have to know what the diseases are. You just need to know what good looks like and what not good looks like, right? Okay. The next thing you're going to be looking for on your frames is food. So in addition to inspecting the brood itself at a close-up view, you're inspecting capped and uncapped larvae. You're looking for a queen. You're looking for eggs to identify if you're queen right. You're also going to be evaluating food resources in the brood chamber as well, because that is where all the young is being raised. Now, honey is one of the food resources that is used in raising brood, but it's only part of the recipe. The other piece of that is pollen, right? So the honey supers just have honey in them. That's for winter. The honey that's stored down in the brood chamber is for use with brood food. And so we're looking for both pollen and nectar in the brood chamber. And is it present and is it abundant? So getting a close-up to this, what you want to see is you want to see pollen stores in your brood chamber, and you want to see some honey stored. If you do not see pollen being stored, you go in and there's no pollen anywhere in your brood chamber. What it means is that likely there is a pollen dearth in the landscape, and you may need to supplement that. Or if you have a colony that's small, that's just not able to send the workforce out to bring enough pollen in, you'll see on those brood chambers, there's very little pollen stored. that might be an indication you need to supplementally feed. Pollen is the critical component. It's the protein source that builds bees. And so without pollen, you are not raising bees. And so a small colony, although it may, be something you just installed and you're just getting going, it still needs pollen in order to raise brood. And if it does not have it, your brood cycles will be much, much smaller as far as the quantity of bees that are being raised, because there's just not the resources. They're not going to raise bees without the food to feed them, is what it comes down to. So you're looking for both pollen presence and food. Now, the amount of pollen is going to vary greatly. Certain times of the year, you may have excess pollen. Sometimes you may not have very much at all, but it needs to be present. It can get excessive. Pollen and nectar storage in the brood chamber can cause issues through backfilling, which is essentially when bees start to run out of space. This becomes a competition between the queen and the workers to find space to put resources. But you want to see food in there. That's something you also need to note is there food present? Now, you don't need to, it's not a category on your inspection sheet, right? You can write that there's plenty of food available, but, normally when I'm looking at a colony, it's when I don't see this is when I want to note that, that this colony is struggling with pollen resources. I added a pollen patty is something I might write in my notes. The next thing you're going to do after you've done all of this, you're going to do a Varroa mite count. And Varroa mite counts using either the alcohol wash or the powdered sugar roll. You see both of them pictured here. The one on the left is powdered sugar roll that we're doing here. The one on the right is an alcohol wash. Whatever one you decide you want to use, this is something you're going to be doing every single inspection and something that you do in the brood chamber. And typically what you want to find is you want to find a colony, you want to find a frame that has a nice mixture of uncapped and capped brood. And essentially the reason that you're using brood frames to collect your bee sample is because the nurse bees are the bees that the mites are going to be on. The foragers, although they're coming in from the landscape and do bring phoretic mites into the hive, the bulk majority of your mites that are moving around in the colony are going to be on the nurse bees. And the reason for that is because mites reproduce in the brood, inside of the brood. So they're always moving around in the brood chamber on nurse bees or from cell to cell. And so that's where you're going to find your sample. If you sample your bees, your half cup that you're taking for your sample of bees that you're going to use in these tests, if you were to take that from a honey frame or a pollen frame, your sample would be biased and it would not be accurate. The other thing, and this is something that you need to understand, is this is something you need to practice. Getting the right amount of bees, a half cup of bees, is not something that comes intuitively, and we'll talk about this, and I'll show you this as we do our Varroa monitoring in more detail. But you need to make sure that you get a full half cup of bees. The number one thing we see as researchers that gives people false indications of mite pressure is that they undersample. It's the number one problem we see with beekeepers, that they undersample. They think, oh yeah, it's almost a half cup. You need a heaping half cup. You want to make sure that you have plenty of bees. And undersampling is one of the major things that causes a lot of confusion around mite pressure. And if you undersample, you may have a mite problem and think that you don't. And that would be detrimental to your colony. So Varroa count is also going to be a very important, one of the most important things you're going to do as far as your inspections are concerned. In addition, when you're working these frames, especially the brood frames, you want to make sure that you're working them over the hive. Your queen, when she is laying, she is very big. And although she can fly, she can only fly for very short distances. And generally, if she lands on the ground, she is never getting back up. If you lose your queen during an inspection, whether she flies away or she drops off of a frame because she's so heavy, that's it. She's not coming back. I'm sorry to tell you, the queen cannot find her way back when she is mated. She's just too heavy. She'll fly for short distances, but she'll never come back. So when you're working a colony, you need to be really conscious of where you're handling your bees. Queens can show up all sorts of different places. I've even had queens that, when I open my top cover, she's on the inside of the top cover in a big hive. So you need to be kind of looking for her when you're first getting into the colony. Generally, she's not going to be on honey frames, but you may have a situation where she's laid a lot of brood up through the entire, hive stack or hive body stack that you have. But it's good practice to make sure that you're handling these bees over your colony. So that if she does drop off, she drops into the colony. I've had lots of folks that, have had queens fall off of a frame and they were right next to a colony, and they come back tomorrow and there's a ball of bees on the ground and a queen in the middle of it. You want to avoid that stuff. Your queen is really important to you, and if you lose her, it is going to be detrimental. And the worst part about losing her during an inspection is if you're at the end of an inspection and say you're putting frames back in, or you're being a little careless, you may not find out that you have lost your queen for 3 or 4 weeks. And by that time, you're going to have a laying worker situation and you've lost the colony at that point. So just make sure you're holding your frames appropriately over your boxes while you're handling those frames. All right, so the last thing I kind of want to leave you with is this kind of notion of what are some of the signs of stress that bees will, let's back it up. What are the things that my bees will tell me that lets me know that they're stressed? Your bees are, again, you're an active participant in this with them. You're working together. This is a collaboration. And, during collaboration, sometimes things don't go how we've planned. And we communicate with one another to work through those complications. Bees are communicating with you. They just don't talk to you, but they are telling you what's going on. And they use a few key signals to tell you that you're stressing them out. And it's usually a good, some of these are a good indicator. It's time to call it quits and close up the colony. All right. So number one, the first thing that you're going to notice that when your bees start to get a little testy with you, most of the time because the colony's been open for too long or you've been mishandling the colony, is they'll start hitting your veil. And again, that's because they are co-evolved with bears as predators, and they use that CO2 signal to determine where vulnerable places are to sting predators. And that's the face. Not a fun place to be stung. So that is the first indicator that your bees are starting to get stressed out. If this continues, kind of the next step of this is that you'll start to see bees putting their butts up in the air and exposing their stingers. And what they're doing is they're exposing those stingers and they're starting to waft that venom. And that's starting to put out an alarm pheromone. The alarm pheromone, one of the key ingredients of the alarm pheromone is isopentyl acetate. Isopentyl acetate is also an active chemical in bananas. And so if you start to smell a little bit of a hint of bananas during this time, that is also another indicator that your bees are stressing out. If you start to smell that alarm pheromone, they're already keyed up. And maybe it's, a good idea to come back to the colony later. We don't have to force ourselves upon these colonies when they don't want to be worked. So this is kind of your second stage, right? Is now you're smelling alarm pheromone in the area. Now, the final kind of piece of this, when a colony gets really upset at you, and colony's been open for too long, you've been working them too hard, is that you'll hear this colony roar, and the colony will just get loud. And that is, if you hear that, it's time to close up shop. It's time to close that colony up and come back on another day. These are your bees. These signals are your bees talking to you. Listen to them. You don't have to do it today. One of the things I think that a lot of us that are not from ag backgrounds, some of us from those non-ag backgrounds, I think that we don't understand what it's like to actually work with an organism. A lot of us that have, I didn't grow up on a farm, but I've worked on farms my whole life. And, one of the things I always understood working on livestock farms in particular is that animals have ways of telling you what's going on. And it's our responsibility as farmers to be able to interpret those signals and make management decisions based on the needs of our animals. It's the same thing here. If you had a steer or something like that that was just beside themselves, or maybe a horse that was just totally inconsolable and just losing its mind because of how it was handled poorly or not treated well, in those situations, you would never put yourself in a corral with that animal, right? If that animal is stressed out and dangerous, we let that animal calm down. It's the same thing with your bees. You need to work with their schedule. It's one of the things that I think, again, many of us don't understand is that when it comes to farming, it's not on your schedule. It's on the cycles of nature. It's on the cycles of your animal. You are working on their schedule. And if you can't make time for their schedule, maybe that's a good indication that beekeeping might not be for you, because the bees are not going to wait for you. They're a biological organism doing their thing. When they need you, and they don't need you to say, oh, I can only work you in 2 weeks. That's hard on the bees, and that's where you end up getting yourself in a situation. So know that this animal is something that you're responsible for, and you gotta pay attention to, and you gotta be able to interpret. Reassembling, pretty easy. You put the frames back in the same way you found them. Same direction as far as what side of the frame is facing inside, and same orientation as far as what number in the cycle they are in. They always go back in the same way they came out. And you start from the middle with your brood frames, push them together, and then you finish with that last honey frame or that last outside frame. Again, so that you're not crushing bees, rolling bees, causing problems. Put them back the same way you put them, or put them back in the same way you took them out. Reassembly of hive bodies, you're going to put those back up on the same way you took them off. The same exact order. Pretty simple. All right, so in summary, for our hive inspections and hive handling lecture, number 1, don't be a bear. Don't be loud. Don't be careless. Don't be rough with your bees. Don't be a bear. Be comfortable. When we talked about gloves, I encourage you to work away from leather gloves, but you need to feel safe as a beginning beekeeper when you're doing inspections, because if you don't feel safe, you're going to be on edge the whole time, and that is going to cause issues. You're going to react to something that you shouldn't be reacting to, and the bees are going to key on you. You need to feel safe and secure so that when you're handling these bees, your mind is not on your safety, but it's on the safety and the comfort of your bees. Be slow and methodical. Have a plan when you go into the apiary, like we've just discussed, what you're going to be doing. Don't just go into a beehive to go into a beehive and just poke around. You should be going in with purpose. And the bees don't generally want you poking around every week in that beehive. Every 3 weeks is a good schedule. It gives your bees time to do what they're doing. You get in, you do your business, and you get out. Get the information you need, make the management decisions you need to do, and then let the bees do their thing. Listen to what your bees are telling you. They're talking to you the whole time. You just have to understand what they're saying. And they say it through certain signals. And we talked about those signals, right? We talked about the hitting your veil. We talked about the alarm pheromone, isopentyl acetate. We talked about these things and how they mean something, that colony roar. Pay attention to what your bees are saying to you. Don't be thinking about other things. Pay attention and be present. And when you're seeing things in the colony that don't look right, pay attention to that too. Those are your diseases. Those are your pathogens and pest indicators. Make sure you're paying attention to those things. It's all there. All the information's in the beehive. It's not like they're hiding anything from you, okay? It's all there. You just have to understand how to interpret it. And that's the hardest thing about beekeeping, is getting into that mindset where you take your education and you combine it into this critical thinking exercise, which is beekeeping. Beekeeping is a career in critical thinking. You're always kind of trying to draw from your knowledge base to make educated decisions on how to manage your bees. That knowledge base, if it's absent, this managing your bees is pointless. So those two things come together in a critical thinking scenario where you're working a live beehive and you use your skill sets to be able to make those good management decisions. And finally, practice. None of us was born a beekeeper. I've been doing this for 15 years and I learn something new every single time I'm in a colony. Always come at beekeeping with a beginner's mind. Never feel like you're an expert. When somebody tells me that they're an expert in beekeeping, immediately I question that. Now, I mean, some of us, have been doing this for a long time. Some of us have fancy degrees in this stuff. And yeah, that's an indication that you kind of know what you're doing. But again, also, there's the practical application, and then there's the academic application of beekeeping. But really, what you need to do is practice. Practicing is how, and reading as much as you can, taking in as much education as you can, is the way that you are going to become a successful beekeeper. I hope this was an educational lecture for you, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thank you.